Just for a bit of context, I'll be 30 in a few months' time as of autumn 2021, and I live alone in a small townhouse/condo that I pay a mortgage on. I work in utility forestry, which means I spend half my day hiking around big transmission power lines and underground gas lines, and the other half in a work truck on my laptop. I don't want to disclose my exact location, but I work near the Atlantic coast for a forestry contractor under a major utility company. Last week I was doing my thing, hiking around, and honest to God, I noticed these weird symbols carved into the trees that were about 2 to 3 rows in. They looked like some wannabe satanic symbols or some shit, and I know the power company I work under has had issues with teenagers riding four-wheelers on the right-of-way. So I instantly assumed it was kids being kids and didn't need to pay it much attention. About 10 minutes later, as I'm just making notes and marking trees with ribbons as needed, I heard a loud crack behind me. I jumped, but my first instant thought was that it was just a branch from a tree falling, as we'd had a lot of storm damage in the area lately. When I turned around though, I saw a little kid standing there, like real little. I'm a single guy, and I've been single my whole life. I don't know anything about babies or toddlers or what age they start walking. But this kid looked like he had just barely started standing up. He still looked unsteady on his feet. I kinda looked him over for maybe 2 seconds while the shock wore off before saying something like, "Whoa, hey buddy, you okay? What are you doing out here?" He just looked at me, and then turned around and trotted away as best he could. He was obviously very short, so he could avoid a lot of low-hanging brush much better than I could, but I kept up with him just as well. I mean, I thought this was pretty weird, but I was seriously worried this little kid was lost or had just escaped a kidnapping or something. I also pulled out my phone, and had literally dialed 911 and was about to dial the last one when I tripped and slapped my face right on a log. It probably looked pretty hilarious from his point of view, but it did hurt like a bitch. I cursed, but when I looked up, the kid wasn't there anymore. I got up and ran as fast as I could into the area I thought he'd went. About 30 seconds later, I came to a clearing, and no joke, there were 2 gas masks hanging on the big poplar tree nearby. They were hanging off these old-fashioned rusty railroad spikes slammed into the tree trunk. The next thing I saw, in hindsight, maybe wasn't overly scary. Like, if it was in a movie, it wouldn't be scary, just curious. But at this moment, it scared me to the core. I suddenly saw a young woman, maybe my age, late 20s or early 30s, peek her head out from behind a tree right next to the one with the masks. From the left side, and on the right side, a face I couldn't tell if it was male or female, wearing a gas mask, poked his or her head out. At that point, I turned on my heel and sprinted as fast as I could back the way I came. I called the cops when I got back to the truck. I won't bore you with all the details of making a report, but as anyone guessed, the railroad spikes were no longer having masks on them when we went back to check. Me and the 2 officers. I have no clue what was happening here, but I told the police everything and they thanked me. They said it might have been a prank though. I really hope it was. Before I begin, I'm really sorry for any grammar errors or spelling mistakes. I'm dyslexic and find writing a little difficult. At the time that this event took place, I was about 13. I'm a girl, and have often found myself in awkward or uncomfortable situations, but this event was probably the one that would change my perspective completely on safety. More specifically, challenging my naive and childish perspective that you're always safe when you're with your parents. A bit of background. My little brother, we'll call him Tom, is severely autistic and is nonverbal. This means he makes a lot of noises at times and does struggle a bit to navigate the world around him. In addition to this, my mum and dad were on bad terms at home, so my mom, my brother, and I would often try and get out of the house to avoid being in it. This was one of those times. I live in a small but busy village with a lot of tourists. so it wasn't unusual to see people I didn't recognize around the area. We decided to have a look at the local flea market, which was halfway up the high street and on the right. To get to the flea market, you had to go through a short alleyway and then into a long building. As you entered, you were greeted by market stalls on the right and left of you. On this particular day, the flea market was very quiet, with only a handful of people around. Perfect, my mom said. This meant Tom, hopefully, would be able to cope and not get overwhelmed with his surroundings. Tom was holding tightly onto my mom's arm as we walked into the building. I immediately spotted the long row of used DVDs and headed right towards them. Tom decided that I was looking at far more exciting things than my mom and proceeded to let go of her arm and walk towards me. I looked back at her to make sure this was okay. She nodded and turned back to the trinkets she was already looking at. I feel I should mention here, my mom was and is extremely protective and was only an arm's stretch away from my brother and I. She had her back turned to us, but only to look at the assortment of trinkets in front of her. She knew that we were close, and after all, what could happen in a quiet flea market when I was only an arm's length away from her? I looked down, my back facing the door to the flea market, and Tom now holding tightly onto my arm, while I was looking excitedly to find a new DVD that Tom and I could take home to watch. I don't really take notice of people normally, and at this moment I was completely lost in my own little world. But you know how people always say they get a feeling right before something bad was about to happen? The hairs stand up on the back of your neck, and you get that feeling you're not being alone. Well, suddenly, I could feel eyes on me. At that moment, a group of people had just walked in and dispersed around the market. I sensed something was off, like someone was stood just behind me. I looked down and slightly to my side, and sure enough, there were two smart-looking shoes attached to a man who was stood right behind me. At first, I thought nothing of it, and decided the man probably just wanted to take a look at the DVDs himself, even though my gut was screaming at me that it wasn't that simple. Why would a grown man stand right behind children to take a look at DVDs? I quickly moved away from them and pretended to look at other things. It was at this point when I realized my gut feeling was completely right. I could feel his eyes tracing me. I got closer to Mom and turned to face the man, but kept my head down, Tom still holding my arm tightly. The man inched closer to us, and I could feel his eyes boring into me. My mom, at this point, had picked up a few things she wanted to buy. She walked over to the cashier with her back still towards me and my brother, and the man. I think, though, that the cashier had noticed the man, as it felt like she was trying to keep an eye on him while still talking to my mom at the counter. He must have noticed the cashier's wary gaze, as he suddenly walked off and seemed to disappear further into the building. I turned to face my mom, who seemed entirely unaware of the situation. The cashier handed her a bag with her things, and I turned back around, ready to leave and tell my mom what had just happened. As I turned to face the exit, though, my heart sank. He had run back around at that exact moment and watched as my mom proceeded to guide us to the door. If you're wondering why I didn't speak up or say anything, I was frozen with fear and honestly couldn't even bring myself to directly look at the man, let alone say something about him. I could only stare at his feet. However, as soon as we exited the flea market, I turned into what I can only describe as a ventriloquist, speaking without moving my lips and muttering to my mom something like, "Mom, there was a man staring at us and following us." She responded with a loud and pointed, "What?" met with me shushing her immediately. "Look behind us and tell me if he's following us now," whispered my mom. I looked around. There he was coming out of the building, placing his hood up and putting his hands in his pockets. Just what the hell did this man want? I was with my mom, for crying out loud. Surely no one would try and hurt me when she was right there. Would they? I turned back, trying not to cry. "He's right behind us," I said quietly. He put his hood up and put his hands in his pockets. At this point, my mind and body separated. I couldn't stop thinking about the man behind us. What if he had something in those pockets? What if he had a knife? "We're going to run around this corner and run into the store in front of us. I want you to go as far into the store as possible," said my mom. And so, with Tom still clutching my arm, we ran through the alleyway, away from the flea market, and around into the next store and through the shop. Well, the part of the plan my mom hadn't told me was that she was going to go into the store and wait and watch the front door to see if he walked by. I didn't notice this till Tom and I had headed into the store already and were now stood in front of a rack filled with magazines and newspapers. When I noticed, I turned to face the entrance and could see my mom huddling herself close to the door while peering through the little windows on it. It was then that I got my first and final look at the man's face. He walked past the shop, turning his head left and right as if searching for me. He was well-groomed, smart-looking, and looked to be in his late 20s, not at all what I had been imagining. Unfortunately, he did spot me through the window and made a quick U-turn into the store. He practically ran inside, and as he did, my mom shouted to me, "We're leaving now!" The man quickly fumbled for a newspaper and kneeled down to one knee as he did. I then ran past him to my mom, and we legged it all the way out of there into the car. We got home safe but shaken up. Mom rang my school and let them know about everything. They also let us know they'd inform the police. To this day, I don't know what that man wanted. Was he just trying to scare me? Why would he do that when he knew I was right there with my mom in a crowded public area? What did he want? I suppose I'll never know. The scary thing is, the police got back to us soon after and told us another girl had reported a similar encounter just that same week. He'd been there before. I hope we never meet again, although I'm 22 now and less tolerant of creeps. Still, I'd rather not have another encounter. This all happened in the fall of 1997, so pre-cell phone days. Being a 16-year-old girl at the time, I thought nothing could break me, and if something bad did happen, I felt like I could protect myself just fine. I wasn't involved in any martial arts, but I was athletic even though I was only 5'2" and weighed about 120 pounds. I considered myself plain to average looking, and was usually oblivious to any flirting directed at me. My mom had picked me up after the art club at school, and we had headed to the local grocery store. When we parked, I noticed a car that was the same make and model of my crush's, parked right outside of the subway. I knew he went there frequently and that his house was nearby, so I was hoping I'd get to see him and maybe say hello. I asked to stay in the car and work on my homework. My mom obliged and left the windows down for me before locking the car and going into the store. As soon as she walked inside, I looked a bit closer at the car and noticed a beaded seat cushion on the driver's seat. I grumbled as I opened my backpack because I realized this was not my crush's car. I'd been doing homework for about 5 minutes when I noticed a car pull in diagonally across from me and then slowly pull through. But the driver didn't park. Instead, he pulled on through and drove around the lot once more before he repeated the same process and then stopped right next to me. I didn't think too much of it. Just thought the person had tried to look for a better spot and had decided to come back to this one. I glanced up, though, to see a man staring straight at me. I looked back down at my book, but I could feel his concentrated stare right on me. He didn't get out of the car to go inside the grocery store. Instead, he just sat there, and I felt my blood pressure rising. Then he started talking to me. "Hey there, what you doing?" I mumbled a small, "Huh?" as I looked up to see him staring at me with a slight smile on his face. I replied that I was doing some schoolwork. "Still in school, huh? You sure are pretty. How old are you?" I had heard before that I looked mature, and I stupidly answered his question honestly and told him I was 16. I immediately felt in my gut that I had just made a huge mistake. The conversation continued, with him asking if I had a boyfriend and all those sorts of other things. Later that night, I realized I probably should have lied and told him my crush was my boyfriend and that his car was parked just next to ours and that he was on the football team. But I was an honest kid and a terrible liar, at least to those who knew me. He would occasionally become quiet as I would restate that I was doing homework, but he would inevitably start talking to me again, telling me that I sure was pretty. I was low-key flattered to be found attractive, but I'd rather it come from someone my own age. I just wanted him to go away, but he stayed. Just as I started to relax a bit and think he'd just annoy me until my mom was done, he suddenly yelled out, "Hey, you ever seen one of these before?" My face grew hot as it flushed, and I was certain I would look over to see a gun pointed at me and he would tell me to get into his car. There were only a few other cars near us and none of their owners had finished their grocery shopping. I turned my head slowly, fighting back tears. Well, he wasn't holding a gun. I shook my head as I didn't recognize the object in his hand, but with the sudden realization of what it was, my face flushed again and I immediately turned away. He had been pleasuring himself this whole time and wanted me to see his handiwork. I was breathing hard and trying not to cry. I still feared he would pull a gun on me or try to get into the car. The windows were completely down and I couldn't pull them up because the car was off. Instead, he calmly turned to me and said, "Okay, I'll leave you alone now." He started his engine. "You sure are pretty though." I didn't look up. He drove out of the spot and I watched the side view mirror as he went out the back exit of the parking lot. As soon as he was gone, I got out of the car and ran to the grocery store to find my mom. We called the sheriff and filed a police report, but I hadn't thought to check the license plate as he'd driven away, and I tried not looking at him the whole time, so all I knew was that it was a rusty red car that may have been a Cadillac. I described him as looking like a young John Ritter with sandy brown hair and slightly hooded eyes. I knew they'd never find him just with that. I didn't have enough to give them. The sheriff said they'd patrol those area parking lots more often, but for the next several years, my heart jumped whenever I saw a car that reminded me of his. I'm so lucky and thankful that nothing worse happened that day. My advice to any younger people would be to just lie and get out of the car even if it leaves you vulnerable. He was parked on my side, but I could have crawled across to the driver's side. Your safety is more important than a car. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here as always. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. I hope you guys are enjoying this sort of daily upload thing. I'm trying to upload as much as possible while I still have the time to, mostly because I find it fun and there's not much else to do while COVID is around, so I hope you guys are enjoying that. If you guys liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. These stories were all submitted to me through my email by subscribers. If you guys would also like to submit stories for me to read in the video, please be sure to take a look in the description below. It will have links to all my social media, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. You can go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get back to your story as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, so I can make it a nice, healthy, long video. Also, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, the theme of the story if it has one, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. Also, make sure you use proper grammar and space your paragraphs and all that stuff, because it's kind of hard to read wall of text submissions. If you guys are new to the channel and you like this, I have two other channels, one where I do disaster documentaries, and another one where I do true crime videos. I do both of those once a week. You'll find links to those in the description as well. Those are called Mr. Blue Skies and Darkest Hour, respectively. Special thanks to my artist. His links to his social media will be in the description below. He does all of my artwork for this channel, and he does the thumbnails as well. If you like his art, so you can check his social media out, and he'll be able to get you something real cool if you're in the mood for that. If you guys are curious about the music, it's listed in the description below in the order which it appears with links to the artists. Other than that, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.